The impact of the New Deal. Let's talk first about organized labor. The prosperity of the 1920s left unions in a pretty weak position. The AFL, the American Federation of Labor, is only accepting, only recruiting, only willing to grant membership to skilled labor. That means no steel workers are in the AFL. That means no auto workers are in the AFL. That's going to change when John L. Lewis, the head of the United Mine Workers, creates another national labor organization known as the Congress of Industrial Organizations, or the CIO. Like the AFL, it's going to be a collection of a bunch of different unions. Lewis is going to use the Wagner Act to help organize unskilled workers. And what the Wagner Act says in regards to this is that if a majority of workers in a factory vote to unionize, vote to create a union, then that means that factory must recognize that union and must collectively bargain with that union. The CIO is going to use this first with U.S. Steel and the steel workers at U.S. Steel in 1937. U.S. Steel and the management of that company realized that the workers had the government's support, and there's little to no fight in 1937 as U.S. Steel workers unionize. In the auto industry, it wasn't quite the same. They actually started to unionize at General Motors in 1936. However, GM refused to recognize the union they created, the United Automobile Workers, the UAW. So the workers had what's called a sit-down strike, where literally the workers just sat down on the job. They refused to work, they refused to move. And the management wanted the governor of Michigan to call in the National Guard, but the Michigan governor refused. And as a result, General Motors concedes and recognizes their union and negotiates a contract with their union. Chrysler follows suit soon after GM. They were independent companies at that time. Biggest name in automobiles, however, takes a lot longer to recognize the United Automobile Workers. Henry Ford fought tooth and nail against unionism in his factories. He hires strikebreakers to replace striking workers, to beat up striking workers, and especially their organizers. It's not until 1941, 5 years after the other big automobile companies, that Ford will recognize the unions in his plants and negotiate with them. By the end of the 1930s, the CIO is bigger than the AFL, and that's due in large part to including the very large steel workers, to including the United Automobile Workers, to including other industries like textile and rubber and electrical and metal workers. And what this means by bringing in unskilled labor into unions is that the union benefits are going to women. They're going to African Americans. They're going to other minorities who often worked in these unskilled fields. So the benefits of union membership are being experienced by more Americans by the end of the 1930s, in large part due to the CIO. However, less than 25% of Americans are actually in unions by 1940. Big industries like the restaurant industry and the retail industry and service industries remain largely unorganized, meaning not in unions, which means people in those businesses generally suffer from long hours and low wages. Let's shift gears and talk about African Americans and the New Deal. In general, the New Deal towards minorities across the board is less effective. It's less helpful than it is for white Americans. African Americans were hit especially hard by the Great Depression. Remember, many of them are sharecroppers or tenant farmers in the South, and cotton is their main crop. Cotton drops to 1/3 of its price during the Great Depression. This really hurts cotton farming African Americans. In cities, African Americans are typically the last people hired and the first fired, especially in the cities in the South. In 1933, urban African Americans suffered from 50% unemployment, well above the national average. There were some built-in racist elements to even some of the New Deal programs. The NRA actually allowed Southerners to pay black workers lower wages for the same jobs. And the AAA, which encouraged farmers to keep land dormant, effectively encouraged Southern farmers to kick off a few tenant farmers because they could get a government check by having that land not have anything planted on it. Another problem is that 65% of African Americans are either farmers or domestic servants. These are industries that are not helped by the Fair Labor Standards Act. That's the one that creates minimum wage. And these are industries that are not helped or not included in Social Security. Those people do not qualify and will not receive Social Security. There are some positives for African Americans in the New Deal, however. When the WPA is headed up by Harry Hopkins, he puts over 1 million African Americans to work in a variety of fields: teaching, arts, construction. And overall, 40% of African Americans are going to receive assistance in some way, shape, or form from the New Deal. FDR himself appoints African Americans to many prominent positions in the government. For example, William Hastie is the first African American to become a federal judge, appointed by FDR. Mary McLeod Bethune heads up the National Youth Administration, which is another New Deal program to create jobs. It's kind of like the CCC, except the workers continue to live at home. It also hired young women as well as young men. Overall, FDR and the New Deal did more for African Americans than any president since Lincoln. I know we talked a lot about the negatives, but you have to remember that not a lot of political success for African Americans since Reconstruction. And as a result, in 1936, African Americans jumped from the party of Lincoln, the Republican Party, and 75% of African Americans vote for FDR in 1936. And African Americans are going to stay in the Democratic Party for the most part until today. Another minority, Mexican Americans, suffered from the economic hardship of the Great Depression. Many Mexican Americans were working in agricultural labor, and they saw their wages cut in half during the Great Depression. They are further hurt when many Americans, like in that picture in the corner, pack up from Oklahoma and Kansas and Nebraska and northern Texas. Pack up to escape the plight of the Dust Bowl and relocate to places like Arizona and California. This was better for Dust Bowl refugees because there was more work out there. However, it's bad for Mexican Americans living in those areas because now there's more competition for the jobs that they were holding. Mexican Americans, compared to your average American, received little federal support from New Deal programs, although the WPA did hire some Mexican American workers for construction projects and cultural artistic projects like this mural seen here in the background. However, Congress declares that no more federal aid will go to aliens, people who are not American citizens, after 1937. And this basically closes the Mexican-American border at the time. Another minority, Native Americans, is going to see some significant improvement in their lives during the New Deal. That has a lot to do with the man put in charge of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, John Collier, who becomes commissioner under Roosevelt. And it has a lot to do with a very important law known as the 1934 Indian Reorganization Act. This basically reversed the Dawes Act, which we talked about earlier. This allowed Native Americans to own land collectively. They can own land as a tribe. It also grants Native American tribes self-government. To a certain extent, they can make rules and laws governing their land. Collier is also going to employ Native Americans in the Bureau of Indian Affairs, novel idea there, and he is going to strongly support education for Native American communities, and he promotes cultural industry. So seeing Native American societies produce things like blankets and jewelry that are part of their culture that can be sold to others. Despite these successes, Native American lands and territories continue to be the poorest parts of the United States.